Today's focus will be on urbanization. You should be connecting this to the objective where we are looking at the effects of industrialization. Urbanization is the rapid growth of cities. You may remember having learned about this in your world studies class. With the rapid growth of cities, what we see is that it's not only the increase in the population in one city, but also the development of the city, including the factories and the housing, and really kind of all the infrastructure that's necessary for a city to develop. I would like you to make sure that you note the growth of some of the major cities in the United States between 1860 and 1900. Especially looking at New York City. If you look at the fact that it was at about 1.1 million people in 1860, and only 40 years later, it's at 3.4 million people. The amount of growth that they saw was huge. You should be thinking about what impact would that have on a city? What would they need to address in order to make sure that their city is developing in a safe and productive manner? You can also take a look at Chicago. Massive amounts of growth there as well. Just over 100,000 people in 1860, and then 1.7 million people by 1900. Again, thinking about how would that impact the landscape of a city during that time period. So urbanization is the rapid growth of cities. The question is, why did they move to the cities? What was the focus in terms of why people would be leaving the rural areas and moving into the urban area? So factories needed workers, and primarily unskilled workers. So what we saw is that people were able to move from the rural areas into the cities and find work because they did not need to possess any specific skills to be able to be hired in the factory. And factories at this time needed tons and tons of workers. So just think about how many people were employed in each of those factories. Along with finding new places to work, they needed to find new places to live, and the cities were able to provide cheap living. With that in mind, we see that the people were able to find apartments, or what we'll be considering them to be, which was the term tenements. They were also very convenient to live in the cities. They were living near work. This is extremely important because of the lack of transportation opportunities at that time period. Another group of people that this was especially important for and why they moved into the cities were the immigrants. They were able to move into these cities, especially New York City, right, with Ellis Island there. They were able to form communities of other immigrants who were from the same culture. And so this made it a little bit easier to transition, especially if you're thinking about the fact that they need to be able to communicate, maybe even being able to share that culture in terms of the food and the lifestyle and things like that. So the immigrants would definitely have found that home within the cities. Here's an image of the city of Chicago. And what's cute, or what's nice to see about this drawing here, is that it shows the different areas in the city of Chicago. So Pilsen, for example, if you look in this area here, actually currently is primarily populated by the Latino population, but that wasn't always the case. So that area has actually gone through several different changes in terms of the ethnicities that would have been prominent there. So think about like Little Italy and Chinatown. All of those areas are developed as a result of different people living in the area at the time. This is where we will focus a majority of our attention for this set of notes. So looking at the rise of the cities, we see that it also brings about a lot of major problems. While the growth of the cities was a benefit to society, we talked about the fact that there'd be a lot of work available, there would be housing available, obviously a center for trade, lots of money. We see that as more people are moving into the cities, more problems are being developed, and the government had to figure out how to deal with it. So they had to figure out ways to deal with services and living conditions. Let's start with housing. If you look at the housing, they would be living in what we call the tenement. You can associate it with an apartment. They were small living quarters with 2 to 3 families in a one-family apartment. So take a moment to envision a one-bedroom family apartment in modern times, and now add 2 to 3 families. And remember, the average family size was much larger at that time. Not only were the people overcrowded, what we also saw was that there was limited or no windows. With the fact that there was limited or no windows meant that it was a breeding ground for diseases. There was lack of sanitation within the housing. There was no fresh air. Another thing that we'll talk about in a minute is the fact that they were lighting the houses with candles. The second piece that was extremely important to note would be crime. There was no police force until 1844. And even once they did develop a police force, it was too small to have an impact on crime. With that in mind, you see that you have a lot of people living in a small area. We know that the working conditions weren't ideal, so there was a lot of people that were underemployed or weren't making enough money, that working poor. And so therefore, with that, there was an increase in crime. People were committing crimes in order to gain access to what they needed. Sanitation is a third piece. There would be sewage and manure on the streets. There were no sewers. There was no garbage collection. And so basically, waste just sat in the streets. There was no clean water and no indoor plumbing. Again, connecting it back to the housing, we see that there's a large spread of diseases in the area. Last but not least, we talked about this in class already, the prominence of fire and fire-related emergencies. So there was little to no water available. They didn't have the massive amounts of fire hydrants and things like that that we have today. And so if a fire did start, it could be extremely catastrophic to an area. To add to that, we also see that there were wooden houses that were lit with candles, right? So they're using candlelight. This obviously can create a problem with overcrowded conditions. And then also to add to the problems, there was a lack of firefighters available in the area. This is a drawing to show you an example of what a tenement was. If you look on here, what's listed with an L means that there would be light. What's listed with a D means that it was dark, no windows available. And then the H are for the halls. If you read the bottom piece here, and these are some examples that you want to make sure that you're getting down, is showing you the size of a tenement. So on that flat, okay, so looking at that floor, you have 12 living rooms and 21 bedrooms, and only six of the bedrooms have any provision or possibility for the admission of light and air. So that means most of those bedrooms did not have any opportunity to gain access to fresh air. If you look at the living rooms, they're about 10 by 12 feet. So if you look on the floor of the classroom, it's about 10 tiles by 12 tiles. So just look at that square. And then if you look at the bedroom, 6.5 by 7 feet. So about 6.5 tiles by 7. And you, again, have multiple people living within the same bedroom. In order to bring light to the fact that people were living in such terrible conditions, Jacob Riis was a photographer, and he actually took pictures of the living conditions for people to show what exactly did the living conditions look like for those who were living in poverty at the time. We'll talk more about Jacob Riis when we get to our progressive part of this unit, but looking at the fact that most people were unaware, or at least the wealthier people were unaware because they just didn't even look at the living conditions of those people. What I want you to do next when you're looking at your notes is I want you to look at each of the photos that's included on here, and I just want you to write down a caption or a description of each photo. So what are you noticing in terms of the living conditions? What concerns might you have if you were living at that time? So looking at this first one, just take a moment and write down your observations, really focusing in on how many people do you see living in those areas? How many people do you think should be living in there? Look at the conditions that they're living in. So pause the video and write down your observations on this picture. Okay, our second one is looking at the living conditions of a family. Again, I want you to note how many beds do you see? How big does the area look to you? How many people are present? What concerns would you have with these types of living conditions? So please pause the video and make your observations. Next, looking at the children in the image. What concerns might you have for their future and for their living conditions? Looking at an alley, how might this impact society? What effect might it have on the living conditions of the people? Another vision, or a view, I should say, of an alley. How safe would you feel walking down there? What concerns might you have? What improvements do you see that need to be made? Looking at the sleeping conditions that people are in. This looks like it is some sort of an abandoned building, so just kind of keeping that in mind. But what does that say about society at the time? Looking at the Market Street. This might be a little bit more positive in terms of what is provided for the people within the cities. And that is it.